All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started this morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. Um, my name is Misty Bose. I'm with the Wildlands Network, and I'm the U.S. Conservation Policy Manager. And we're so glad you're all here from all across the globe, it looks like today. And I wanted to kick us off today to just thinking about a really basic question. And that question is, how can we better share this road that we're all interacting with every day? We drive on roads. How do we better share them? And so every year, more than 350 million vertebrate animals and more than 200 people are killed by traffic in the US. And these crashes cost us over $10 billion every year. And so we know wildlife crossings are a proven, cost-effective solution for enhancing road safety and protecting both wildlife and drivers. And we know that wildlife crossings reduce a lot of these collisions and can take a lot of different forms, from the big, beautiful crossings we see out in Banff to the simpler interventions like fencing that I'll talk about later. We can really significantly reduce crashes. But before we ever see infrastructure like this, someone has to inspire change and really rethink how we've typically not considered wildlife when we were constructing roads. And that's where you all come in, and that's why we're just so glad you joined us today for this webinar. So Wildlands Network has been supporting and driving legislation across the country about this for years, and helping people think about how wildlife can cross roads safely and ensure they have a safe place to go once they actually get across the road. And so today we're going to share a couple case studies, one from Virginia, where I'm based, and one from Colorado, where David's based. And we're going to be exploring how citizens initiated action on wildlife crossings. And we'll be discussing how to motivate legislators to address this issue and the importance of staying involved even after legislation passes. And additionally, we're going to think about, what kind of resources you need to support you as you work on creating wildlife corridors in your state. And so these presentations are meant to inspire you to envision roads and that support both people and wildlife, whether you're supporting existing efforts or pushing for new initiatives. We really hope to leave you motivated to make a difference. And so as we go through these presentations, please use the Q&A function for questions, and Jonathan will address as many as he can at the end of the presentations. And just to get us started here, to kick us off, I'm proud to introduce Erin Cito. She will share some new resources that we've developed to help you advocate for wildlife crossings. And Erin is the U.S. Policy Director at Wildlands, and she researches, develops, and promotes laws and policies supporting habitat connectivity, wildlife crossings, and biodiversity at all levels of government. And Erin's work also focuses on building community support and securing government investment to implement these policies nationwide. So take it away, Erin.
Thanks, Misty. Do you mind if I share my slides, or are you going to share them?
Go for it.
Okay, excellent. Let me share my screen really quickly. All right, everyone's seeing everything okay?
Perfect.
Yep.
All right, wonderful. So as Misty said, my name's Erin Cito. I'm the U.S. Public Policy Director for Wildlands Network, and I'm coming to you live from the Eastern Wildway, which I always love to show, the Wildway vision, and then again, just that Eastern Wildway that you might notice for those that may be familiar with the Florida Wildlife Corridor artwork. We had similar artwork drawn up for the Eastern Wildway. So I'll be sharing my slides later. There's a lot of fun little nuggets throughout. Feel free to look through everything. But I'm here today to sort of do some level setting and talk a little bit about how you can get involved in advocating for wildlife crossings and wildlife corridors. And if there's a few key takeaways I hope that you get today, I hope that you're able to, understand habitat connectivity generally, if you aren't already familiar with it, the importance of it, corridors versus crossings. I hope that you're able to have some tools to take away with you to understand the current landscape, existing federal policies, state policies, some great examples of advocacy in your community, which David and Misty are going to be covering a little bit later on in this presentation. And then I hope that you're able to take all of this and then think about how you may want to contribute. Nadia is going to be giving us an excellent presentation on how you can advocate for wildlife corridors and crossings, but that's certainly not the only thing that you can do to help these environmental initiatives. If you are a scientist, you can contribute scientific knowledge. If you are a citizen interested in collecting roadkill data, you can certainly do so to help inform where crossings should go. And then if you have the privilege to donate financially to help build these crossings, we certainly hope that you consider it. So thank you so much for taking away all of these great presentations and thinking about how you may want to help implement wildlife corridor and crossing conservation in your state. So I will get us started with a little bit about habitat connectivity and why it is important. We are obviously in the midst of two crises, the climate crises and the biodiversity crises. And the number one contributor to biodiversity loss that we have seen over the years is habitat fragmentation. So these big blocks of forest are getting blocked up. Animals are no longer able to move between habitat to habitat, and so they're genetically isolated. It makes them weaker as a species, and sometimes they perish as a result of that. So it is so important to make sure their habitats are connected so these species can be resilient, particularly in a changing climate. I also just want to briefly touch on, I know, sorry if this is all like, yesterday's news to you. I'm sure you're all wonderful advocates already for wildlife crossings and corridors, but I do just want to share some distinction because we do hear a lot about the two different words and sometimes they're used interchangeably. But wildlife crossings are a very specific type of man-made infrastructure. The overpasses, the underpasses, the culverts, all the things that you see that are specifically related to safe road passage. And then these crossings can be part of a corridor, which is a larger wildlife movement area. And that takes into account the animal's pathway to be able to move throughout a landscape. So crossings can certainly be part of it, but they are one distinct thing. So I do just like to point that out, particularly as we jump into the state legislation a little bit later. You'll notice that some of the policies pass a date, both at the state and federal level. Some have to do with wildlife crossings specifically, and some have to do with wildlife corridors as a whole. So that's just why I think it's important to think about those two distinctions. I'm not going to go over this slide. Like I said, I will definitely be sending these things to you a little bit later so you can really dig into these nuggets, but I am a policy wonk. I love digging into all of the legislation and all of the state and federal policy that's out there on connectivity. So this is just a nice timeline of substantive administrative policy and legislative developments at the federal level specifically. And the reason why I'm just showing you this is because I think most importantly, to be a successful advocate, it's so important to know what's come before you and what you're working with so you can figure out what's working or how you can improve the existing frameworks that are in space in law and policy. So please feel free to dig into these a little bit more in all of your follow-up research, which I'm sure you'll be doing to advocate. In addition to the substantive legislative policy, I think it's just also important to point out that there has been unprecedented amount of federal funding provided for wildlife corridors and crossings over the last few years. And this becomes especially important when you look at all of the catalyzing effect that this has had on states passing legislation. So we're talking billions of dollars through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. And then I just like to highlight, some potential policy advocacy opportunities in the future, which I'd be happy to, respond to emails later on about how folks can get involved. But there is some federal farm bill legislation that's been introduced to support habitat connectivity. And then there's also 3 other potential bills to watch as we move in throughout Congress. There is a tribal bill, the Native Americans Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Act, and then the Wildlife Movement Through Partnerships Act are the most promising 2 bills at the moment to just keep an eye out for. And again, happy to answer any questions about these pieces of legislation or policy. So again, I had to start with the federal work because I think it's so important to catalyzing the state efforts that have happened over the last few years. And with that, I'm just going to jump into a tool that Wildlands Network has recently introduced. It's called the State of the States Report. It looks at the past 25 years of habitat connectivity, wildlife corridor and wildlife crossing legislation at the state level, particularly. And the federal, like I said, the federal policy has definitely influenced this, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute here. So this report is chock full of amazing graphs, case studies, and a full glossary of all the legislation out there to date. We also do a little bit of comparing approaches amongst states. So if you really want to do your research ahead of time before advocating and find out what's already happening in your state at the local level, I highly recommend digging into this report, which Misty will be sending out to participants afterwards. So the first bill that was passed in habitat connectivity legislation was Florida back in 1999, creating the Florida Forever Act and the Florida Forever Program, sorry, via the Florida Forever Act. And that really got the state started in researching the lands that it needed to protect and connect to help combat some of the development and expansion that has been happening in the state really for the last 25 years and then some. And you'll see that habitat connectivity legislation sort of chugged along for a little bit. In 2014, we started to see a little bit more of it. California particularly started passing a lot of legislation. And then in 2018, two things happened. Secretary Zinke, under the Trump administration in 2018, signed Secretarial Order 3362 as the Secretary of Interior, tasking the states with studying the movement of big game and also creating initiatives to conserve the big game migratory corridors in the western states. So that happened at the beginning of 2018. And then later on that year, Wildlands Network actually presented at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators Forum, presented a wildlife corridor model legislation concept to over 100 legislators, and several legislators tailored that to their states and then passed it in the years to follow. So you can see a huge spike in interest once 3362 was signed and once legislators had a concept in their hands that they could tailor to their states, which was really exciting. So things start to move along. Obviously, we have this huge uptick in legislation, and then there's quite a bit of a drop. And this is just me guessing at this point, but what we had heard was that states wanted to do this work, but didn't have the funding to do it. And so Congress answered the call in 2021 with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, creating for the first time $350 million in dedicated funding to help construct wildlife crossings across the US. And so with the promise of federal funding to support all of this legislation, you can see that there was a massive growth, importantly here in this green line, in past legislation. We love to see legislation introduced, but even more important, get that legislation passed. So these are some of the catalyzing events that helped push state legislation. The Inflation Reduction Act also had a little bit of impact, but for different reasons. With the Inflation Reduction Act, you saw a massive growth of incentives for solar development. And so folks interested in conserving and protecting habitat are now introducing legislation aimed at trying to make sure that we are siting renewable energy right and not having grave impacts on wildlife as we reach our renewable energy goals. So I'll quickly go through these last two slides as I know I'm running out of time, but just a few extra nuggets of information from this report. You can see which states have already passed legislation and which states have introduced legislation. You can also see particularly which states are very active in this work. So super interesting. In this graph, you have Wyoming, Florida, and California all passing the most legislation to date, which is fascinating because they're all very different states politically. It just goes to show how bipartisan this issue is, which makes it really exciting to get behind. And then this graph shows, and it'll go into more detail in the report, there's a lot of different types of legislation. So there's habitat legislation, specifically conserving corridors. There's funding to provide funding for wildlife crossings and habitat conservation. There's studies out there that require the states to figure out either where they want to put wildlife crossings or where they want to conserve lands. There's coordination bills that require, say, the state DOTs to consult with the wildlife agencies in the state to make sure that they have all the data available to them before they set these priorities for their states. And then there's a really great suite of bills in permitting, we say permitting and process, which essentially creates triggering mechanisms that makes the state act when they're developing a project in an area that would fragment habitat. There's some great case studies within the report. Potentially your state is included, so I highly encourage you to take a look. And it shows you the corridors that have been identified through some of these state initiatives and some of the wildlife crossing projects here in New Jersey on the left, and these red dots in Virginia on the right are where they hope to put crossings. And then just the last piece of the presentation quickly today is just the highlight of what the glossary looks like at the end of the report. Really helps you understand, which states have passed legislation, who are the agencies affected, what time frame are we looking at in terms of passage, and then how are these bills grouped into what category: studies and plans, permitting and process, habitat and funding. And so that is sort of a very quick State of the States report in a nutshell, but it is a very dense and robust report. just like these pronghorn. I hope you run, not walk, to go and read it, because I think it's a really great place as to start when you're thinking about how you can advocate for wildlife corridors and crossings at the state level. It's really understanding where you are. So I hope this provided a little bit of level setting to go into some specific examples that I know David and Misty will be providing in terms of success stories.
Thanks, Erin. And yes, remember, put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll have them all at the end. Make sure we get them in. Thank you, Erin. And I know that those publications sure helped me. So I'm excited about this one too. All right, David, do you want to get your slides ready and I'll introduce you? All right, so next we have David Ellenberger. He's my colleague out in Oregon. And David has worked on environmental and legislative efforts for over 30 years with nonprofits such as the Yarra Club, National Wildlife Federation, and the Pew Charitable Trusts. And last year he joined us at Wildlands Network to advocate for connectivity legislation in Oregon and Washington State. And today he's going to be talking a little bit about the Colorado Coalition building that he's been working on and all the success they've had out there. So take it away, David. Looks great.
All right. Thanks, Misty. And welcome to everybody. This is a topic I could definitely talk about all day, but I'm going to try and condense it into about 10 minutes. So here we go. This first slide, I just wanted to show this to y'all. Colorado's kind of been widely acknowledged in the West as being a leader in identifying and constructing wildlife crossings across the state. This map shows about 65 crossings that have been built already in Colorado, and you can click on each of the individual ones and get some pictures and cool information on what those crossings are for and why they were built and when they were built. I think that number is probably closer to 70. It's been about 3 years since this was updated, but wildlife vehicle collisions in Colorado are a big problem. There are about 4,000 recorded wildlife vehicle collisions each year, and the important word there is recorded because scientists actually think that's a massive undercount. It's probably more like 14,000 wildlife vehicle collisions, many of which are unreported. It's about an $80 million fiscal impact to the state every year, and that includes the cost of lost wildlife to the state. And yeah, so Colorado's been a leader on this issue in the West in taking action and really implementing an agenda that's involved all walks of people involved, getting involved in helping to build these important structures, not only for wildlife's safety and longevity, but also for humans. This is a picture of one of the overpasses on Highway 9 in north central Colorado. I guess it was built in 2016 as part of a highway mitigation system that includes 7 structures along this highway. And I don't know what it is about building an overpass for a state, but every state that constructs an overpass and sees the results, this series of underpasses and overpasses that were built, they did a 5-year monitoring report and found out that these 17 different species of animals were recorded using the crossings, including river otters, which was an odd one. But also, and this number is an undercount, 112 documented passages of mule deer in just 5 years using these structures in crucial winter range. So it was a real success, and it was led actually by a large landowner in the area called Blue Valley Ranch, which committed more than $1 million to this project and really urged the State Department of Transportation to get involved in this project. Took about 10 years to get it all ironed out, but they did it in 2016, and this was led to a Renaissance era, I think, in Colorado for constructing wildlife crossings. Colorado has a lot of elements to, I think, its secret sauce, but one of them, for sure, in my mind at least, is the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance, which is a partnership between the 2 state agencies that manage wildlife and the agency that manages roads. Also includes a number of really important stakeholders, including federal agencies, tribal, academic, nonprofits, biological and engineering science partners, and then just even people just from all walks of life that are interested in this topic. And they have a mission to provide safe passages for people and wildlife in Colorado, and it's a collaborative effort to improve human safety and integrate wildlife movements into their transportation system in the state. It's been a really amazing organization. You can see some of the partner organizations listed below there. As I said, it formed out of a summit that was led in 2017. And after that summit, the agencies, they were having a problem in the state managing mule deer. The wildlife agency came to the Department of Transportation in the mid 2000 or about, I guess, around 2015, and we're having a problem with declines in mule deers. They actually found through this Western Slope wildlife prioritization study that they were losing more collared doe mule deer to cars and wildlife accidents than were actually being legally harvested by hunters each year. So it was a significant population threat to these species. They completed a similar study on the Eastern Slope to identify hotspots where they were having a lot of crashes in 2022. And that provided a holistic state picture that identified, amazingly, like 450 miles of roads in 150 road segments that were really in need of some sort of mitigation. I mean, a huge price tag, obviously, to implement that, but it kind of set the bar for what Colorado needed to work on. As Aaron pointed out, there were secretarial orders at the federal level in 2017 and 2018. That led to the governor of Colorado in 2019 issuing his own executive order for the state agencies to work together to solve the problem for big game species in the state. They signed an MOU in 2019, and that led to some really cool legislation in 2022 called SB 151. I actually wrote the first draft of this legislation. It was very much a citizen and nonpartisan effort to create a fund within the state treasury to help address this issue and prepare for the federal funds that were going to be coming down the pipe very shortly. Colorado definitely got ahead of the curve on this one. And, with a lot of the roadway projects that the federal government was funding, they could get a 4-to-1 match basically on federal money to state money. So setting aside $5 million, was a big deal. And it immediately helped kind of change the game. These were a lot of the partners involved, and you can see the diverse list of, obviously the nonprofit suspects, the usual suspects, but we also had county commissioners involved. We had contractors, insurance industry. We had the American Petroleum Institute, oddly. So lots of interesting, diverse groups coming together to make this fund a reality. The fund immediately led to advancing a number of projects, some augmenting some projects that were already starting construction, helping to make whole some projects that were ready to start construction but didn't have full funding to start construction, and then picking out a few projects that were on the longer term horizon that needed support just to get off the ground and start planning for these crossings. And one of those that I'm going to zero in on today is near and dear to my heart. It's called the Eastvale Pass Wildlife Crossings in north central Colorado. I'm part of the board of directors of a group called Summit County Safe Passages. And it's an amazing citizen group that started around 2015 between the Denver Zoo and a group called Rocky Mountain Wild, doing citizen science monitoring along this stretch of highway. I-70 corridor is a huge corridor in Colorado. It's called the Colorado Mountain Corridor. It has a lot of traffic going east to west, human traffic. Wildlife wants to move north to south, and this has become a hard barrier because there's about 23,000 cars a day that travel this section of highway, and it's become just basically impenetrable to wildlife movement. Mule deer studies have shown that they need about 60-second break in traffic to cross the highway, and this, even on a slow weekday, the breaks are maybe 20 seconds at most. And so wildlife has basically stopped crossing in this area. So they did a feasibility study. They raised money from Vail Resorts and Arapahoe Basin and a nonprofit called Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and finished a feasibility study, came up with the designs for 3 wildlife mitigation structures here, which are shown here on the bottom. Those yellow dots underneath the proposed structures, the highway actually bifurcates in this area. And so there's a westbound lane and an eastbound lane. And the eastbound lanes have some span bridges that could facilitate wildlife movement. But the westbound lanes, unfortunately, on the top there, do not have access for wildlife to get across into that median zone and eventually onto the part of the highway, or below the southern part of that area. So this was the solution. It was centered around Canada lynx. So the proposal, these were reintroduced to the state in the 1990s, and this was the only, there's a breeding population of lynx in this area, and it's the only population outside of Southwest Colorado. And so these crossings could facilitate movement of Canada lynx into the more northerly Rockies. And it's just an exciting proposal. Of course, they wouldn't be the only species to use this. There's the full suite of mountain species that inhabit this area and would also use the crossings, but this proposal was developed for lynx. And as I said, it's an important travel corridor in the state, and just the traffic volumes are just such a significant barrier that animals just can't make it anymore. These were also an issue, I think, for the state because although this was started by all volunteer group, this Summit County Safe Passages, it was not identified in either of the priority studies that I mentioned before, because those studies were basically crafted around elk and big game, mule deer, things that could really hurt you in a wildlife vehicle collision. Lynx are not one of those species, and so this was not on the priority list. Also that, and because wildlife has basically stopped trying to cross in this area. So there's not as many accidents as there are in some other parts of the state. So we had a challenge in front of us to get this on the radar of the state agencies that we needed their help to actually get these crossings built. In 2022, after the SB 151, the Colorado Wildlife Safe Passages Fund was established, we came up with a novel idea and basically planned all summer to put together a field trip to take important VIPs out to this area, both elected officials, county officials, state agency officials from CDOT, from the Department of Transportation. And we had a special guest star, the Governor Polis's husband, the first gentleman of Colorado, Marlon Reese, who's a humongous wildlife advocate, came on the trip as well. And we did a briefing at Copper Mountain, actually, to just inform people, walk them through the proposal, educate them a little bit about what was at stake. And then we actually took them out and onto the roadway, basically above where the crossings were going to be proposed. And we put the question to the director of CDOT at the time, with her, essentially the spouse of her boss, standing nearby, and asked, will you take on this project? And fortunately, our tactics there worked, and they said yes. So that was a huge leap forward for this project becoming a reality. They ended up getting, just after that, about $750,000 from the first round of SB 151 funding in the state, which really brought this project to life. I mean, it made it real for not just for our group of people involved in this project, but also for funders, both large and small, to start contributing to this project and really making it real now that we had some money to actually start planning and getting serious about this. You can see that the state kind of narrowed down their priority projects to 6, and Eastvale Pass became one of those, and then were eventually submitted last year for a wildlife crossing pilot program grant. Those 3 of these projects, and 2 of those, actually, one of them received over $20 million on I-25, and then just earlier this year, actually, and then another one of those projects that was submitted received a $60 million grant. So they've been having some success in Colorado. Eastvale Pass did not get the wildlife crossing pilot program funding, but is still pushing forward and working on a number of grants to this day. And I just wanted to focus in narrowly about the topic of this conversation we're having today. I mean, sometimes people think, what can I do? I mean, how can I get involved in this? And I just want to say, we're an all-volunteer board. This letter to the editor was submitted by a guy named Mike Wynn. He's a retired guy that lives near Copper Mountain and has no experience in wildlife advocacy at all. He has a background in finance, actually, and so he joined the board of directors because he cared about this project and read about it in the paper, and was wanted to get involved. And he's ended up giving $50,000 of his own money to make this project come to fruition. He's been writing letters to the editor. He's been helping in any way he can, and just admittedly, like, learning a lot about how fun it is to join with a group of committed volunteers to get wildlife crossings built. We did a field trip last year with a group called EcoFlight. It's a nonprofit that does overflights of areas, and we took a bunch of VIPs up into the air to actually show them the area and what's at stake. And we flew them over the Highway 9 crossings that I showed you earlier and showed them how those were working, and just did really made a wonderful day out of it, and it really helped, I think, people envision what could be possible in this area. We did a evening conversation in December with Ben Goldfarb, the author of the Wildlife Crossings book, recently a bestseller. And then, I just listed a bunch of things here to show people how they, we planned field trips, we did overflights, we did community events, they did Rotary events, they did fundraisers at Copper Mountain during ski days. We have a monthly newsletter, we do social media posts pretty regularly, we do media outreach. We work with state and county and local elected officials. We apply for grants, large and small, and we form partnerships with allied groups, funders, and communities, and just through our network. And then lastly, I'll just conclude and say though we didn't get the big money through the federal government, we did recently get about $725,000 just announced in April. 450,000 of which was from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and then $275,000 in matching funds from the Colorado Wildlife Safe Passages Fund. So thank you for your time. I hope I was on 10 minutes there, Misty, but I'll turn it back to you.
We all have trouble staying on time with this stuff. I totally get it. Thank you. That's awesome. I put a couple of links in the chat for folks so you can see the groups that David's talking about. And again, add those questions to the Q&A. We'll be sure to get to them at the end. And real quick, I wanted to introduce our next speaker. We're so glad to have Nadia here with us. Nadia Steinzor is an environmental consultant with 25 years of experience in policy analysis, research, writing, and communications. And she's developed and managed projects to investigate the oil and gas industry's impacts on climate and communities, and to secure governmental protections for air, water, land, and wildlife. Importantly, she engages the public in advocacy efforts, and that's why we've invited her here today. And Nadia is currently working with the Rewilding Institute to ensure that wolves and other carnivores thrive and roam in the Northeast and beyond. She holds an MS in environmental policy from the Bard College Center of Environmental Policy. And she'll be talking a little bit about strategies to influence legislators and push for implementation of legislation. So take it away, Nadia. Thank you.
Yep, there we go. I'm unmuted and you can see my screen.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much to the Wildlands Network for having me here today. I am excited to talk about this issue. It's something that I got very involved in my graduate school. I actually did an internship with then it was Wildlands project, and have returned to this work recently in part to help advocate, working with Wildlands Network and many other groups, to advocate for the Wildlife Crossings Bill in New York State, which where I live. I live outside Woodstock, New York. So I wanted to start with this slide because I think it kind of shows who's in charge of the road and how being bold and moving in a pack can change things. So let me go. Why is this not advancing? There we go. So I think I wanted to start with a little bit of a bigger picture of what advocacy is and what we're aiming for. It's really easy to get sort of overwhelmed by all the opportunities, but also just all of the issues that we're faced with. And where do you find a space to enter the coalitions and the work in a way that feels comfortable for you and feel like speaks to your strengths? And I think that that's the most important thing when you're considering and getting involved in advocacy. So I'll just throw out there a definition of advocacy, which I try to keep in mind. It is to represent, promote, or defend a person's interest or opinion. And in this case, we are defending the interests of wildlife, and we're representing and promoting the laws and the policies and the projects that we think are important. Advocacy can be a lot of different things. I think first and foremost, and I think David covered this really well in the way that they went about their project, it is very strategic. There, you need to have a plan of action to bring about the change. What are you trying to achieve, and what are the different ways to get there? And that takes us to being deliberate. So there should always be clear ideas and asks. I think it's pretty hard to enter, meetings or writing letters or whatever the tactic is you're going to do, which we'll discuss a little bit later, without being really clear about what you're trying to achieve. And that could be a lot of different things, but you need to be clear about it and define that set of asks. And then some of you may have heard the phrase of who can give you what you want. And that is something really important in advocacy campaigns, to be really targeted and clear. Is it a policymaker? Is it an agency? Is it the media? And even within the media, is it, my local paper, or is it the newspaper that all the legislators in Albany read? And so always be really clear about who your target is and what who can help you achieve your goals. And then the other thing is just sticking with it and staying engaged. It's hard sometimes. Policy is a very slow-moving operation, and the scale of the need, whether it's climate change, biodiversity loss, or protecting wildlife in our local areas, are very urgent, and they're very immediate. And the problems that are occurring while we're all busy making policy can sometimes be overwhelming and heartbreaking. And so I think it's really important to just feel like you can stay engaged with the people you're working with and with the coalitions and with the issues as they shift and change, and as, celebrate the victories, stay engaged as you move gradually toward reaching your goal. Excuse me. So I would say that a key, I want to just mention what some of the key tools are in doing advocacy. And I think today we're getting a lot of the first one, which is information. Groups like the Wildlands Network and other members of coalitions on these issues will be able to provide great information, talking points. Erin talked about the report. Digest as much as you can, become informed. And that's all part of the second piece, which is preparation. Always be ready to talk to people and go into meetings well prepared. That doesn't mean you have to be an issue expert, but again, just have like a comfort with the issues. And then I would say also flexibility really matters. As Misty mentioned, I spent a lot of time working on oil and gas issues during the heyday of the fracking wars in the Northeast. And certainly anyone here from the West or pretty much anywhere in the country is familiar with fracking and the onslaught of oil and gas development. And we had to really change our tactics and sometimes our views and sometimes our approaches over the years as the issues evolved. So in the beginning, it was all about preventing fracking and oil and gas drilling. And then over time, it became about, protecting community health. But they're all part of the same issue. It's just, to be flexible, to be able to lend your voice and be involved in a variety of issues. And I think patience is also really critical, maybe because I'm getting some gray hair. I feel like patience is a virtue more and more. And that means patience with the people who are your targets. Sometimes legislators and the media, they're not always so involved. They may not have the same passion for the issue. And it's really up to all of us to guide them through that process so that we help them become advocates for what we are advocating as well. And patience with each other when we're working together. I do want to mention positivity. Again, it can be really hard in the face of overwhelming bad news and sadness and difficulty about what's going on in the world. But somebody once told me, and again during the fracking wars, that people don't want to just hear what you're against. They want to hear what you're for. So this kind of, or hope instead of nope is another phrase. So, I'll give you an example. As much as my heart breaks when I see dead animals on the road, or when try as I might, like I was a couple weeks ago driving home in a warm rain, try as I might to avoid hitting a frog, I still did. I probably wouldn't go into a meeting and lead with like the devastation I see and the sadness. I would be more positive about, oh, we could make the change so this doesn't happen. We could avoid, we can create better lives for wildlife and communities. So it's just kind of find that nuanced step. That doesn't mean you don't talk about the sadness, which I'll mention in a bit, but always just really keeping your eye on the goal and that we can get there if we work together. And I think that resonates a lot with people. And the last thing I would say is some willingness to make some noise. We actually just had a coalition call about the New York Crossings bill this morning. And I asked Erin the question, like, are we going to criticize the agency, or what are we going to do here? Are we looking at being sort of delicate and measured in our messaging, or when is it time? And I think that's something that if you're involved in advocacy, you can feel your way forward. But if you're working in a coalition and you're working with a group like Wildlands Network, it's good to sort of figure out when it's time to make some noise. And I'll give another example from my work on fracking. There was a point at which in the environmental agency in Pennsylvania, there was this big thing going on, and we had monthly meetings. We did letters to the editor. We had strategy sessions. We were one-on-one behind the scenes with the people in power, and nothing was working. So we staged a rally outside the agency's office and disrupted everybody's lunch hour. And it was after that we started making some traction. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we started getting there. So I think there is a time and place to make some noise. But again, the experts on these issues are going to make that call, and it's going to be pretty nuanced, I think, on when it's advantageous to. But I think that's another good thing as an advocate, to feel like you're fired up enough that you're willing to get in people's faces sometimes. At least that's what I think. So I do want to say how to speak out and take action. There's a whole variety of things. And again, David covered some of this. I think a really key part of advocacy is lobbying, of course, meeting with agency staff, whether that's a Department of Transportation or Environmental Conservation, meet with government officials, and of course, your legislators. There is nothing better than somebody showing up in person, or at least making a phone call. If you're a constituent of somebody who's on a committee or can move a bill, make sure you reach out to them and try to get a meeting, whether it's part of an organized lobby day or just on your own. Another great thing to do is to write letters to the editor, contribute to articles, do social media around these issues. And if you're part of an organization, writing memos in support of a bill is really important, so that the legislators know that there's not just one organization behind this, but 20 organizations, and you're willing to take the work and the resources to demonstrate that. And then even just lending your name. I know there's different schools of thought about how much agencies and legislators pay attention to kind of those stock action alerts that we all click on. But if that's a place where you're comfortable doing that, and you can personalize the message, whether it's comments on a bill or a regulation, or you just want to click on the action alert, that's super important. I've been in situations where an agency has said, well, we only consider unique comments on a bill or on a regulation. But getting 30,000 petition signatures still makes a difference for them. And so it is really important to just be willing to lend your name. And even if you just are talking about the issue, like what empowers you? Why do you care about this? What about wildlife crossings matters to you? At hearings, or even just with family and community, it spreads the word, it creates a buzz, it builds momentum. And then showing up to public events. I know we do a lot of things on Zoom now, but even showing up to a webinar like this, or showing up to a hearing, again, strengthen numbers and the power of your voice. So finally, I'll just say a couple of rules of the road, I think, for engagement as well. Know why you care so that others will, and really tap in to your inner motivation so that you can speak with it with power and with patience and with motivation. Is it safety for people and wildlife? Is your heart breaking about climate change and the need for animals to migrate? Is it the loss of species in your own community? And again, as I mentioned before, I think the personal motivation and the personal stories really matter. Have you hit an animal recently? Have you had an accident? Do you know somebody who had an accident? Or when was the last time that you stopped? I do this when I'm riding my bike all the time and moved a turtle or a snake across the road. Like tap into those feelings so that you take it with you. I think you'll be a much more convincing advocate. And my favorite is remind agencies and legislators who they work for. They work for you, they work for the public. Sometimes they have to be reminded that certain things are in their mandates, part of their mandate to create, safety on the roads. It's part of their mandate to protect wildlife, whatever it is. Sometimes they have to be reminded, and that's the job of advocates. And again, just focusing on the benefits to society or the dollar savings. We talk a lot about, the cost for insurance and for individuals of accidents with wildlife. Those kinds of things are really important for agencies and for legislators who are constantly balancing budgets and dealing with the fiscal responsibilities. And the final thing I'll say, and again, this comes a lot from working on fracking, but I think it comes with crossings too, is that there will always be opposition. There will always be somebody who will be a naysayer or somebody who will come out and say, we don't need that. Why are you creating a crossing for wildlife? We can barely fund our schools, or whatever the talking point of opposition is. And I think it's important sometimes to push back on those things, but also really important to stay focused so that you all have cohesive messaging and talking points and you can break through those barriers of opposition. Sometimes you have to respond. A lot of the time you don't. And save your energy for the positive forward moving action. And most importantly, support each other. These are long time issues. Like with the bill in New York, it's passed the legislature. It's amazing. Hasn't gotten to the governor's desk yet, or it's on the governor's desk waiting for signature. It's a long haul. We need to support each other and keep working together and remember who what you're all aiming for together, because it's easy to find dividing lines and coalitions and so on and get annoyed with each other over things, but we're all pulling in the same direction and working for the same goal. So I don't even know how long I've been talking, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. That's awesome. I have some questions, so I'm going to go pretty quick so I get to ask them. I love the work you've been doing. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So for this webinar, we really wanted to focus on what catalyzed change in states across the nation, right? What were those pivotal events and how did wildlife crossings evolve from just an idea to some legislation that actually passed? And I'm going to be talking about Virginia because it's where I live. I'm in Charlottesville, and it's a state I've been involved in for over a decade now. And for those of you that aren't based here, I would just like to let you know that Virginia is breathtaking. It's a biodiversity hotspot with an incredible array of special and unique species. Because of that, lots of people want to live here and lots of people want to visit. And that means we have roads. We have lots of roads. There's over 58,000 miles of state maintained roads, the third largest network in the nation, carving our state up into pieces. And this picture here is of Shenandoah National Park, which is a long, narrow park. And it actually has a road running right down the length of the whole park. And it can actually be really hard to find a spot on that road where you don't hear it, or in that park where you don't hear that road. And of course, every year we lose black bears and countless other species on that road. And those crashes are increasing, of course. So last year, drivers crashed into wild creatures in Virginia over 81,000 times in 2022 in just 1 year. And Virginia was recently ranked the 9th highest risk state for animal vehicle collisions in the US. And if you want to see how your state stacks up, you can visit this website at the bottom of the page here, and it'll help you see like where your state lands in terms of these animal vehicle collisions. And just remember, I think we mentioned this already, but when you look at these numbers, those actual numbers are probably much higher than what gets reported. So as I mentioned, black bear collisions are increasing in Virginia. It's estimated that about 1,000 to 1,300 bear collisions happen every year. But these stats are terrible. And as Nadia just said, these are things we have to keep in mind, but you all know we have this problem or you wouldn't be here. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to share, how wildlife corridor policy got started in Virginia, some of the key people involved, some of the things we've done already, and then most importantly, what's next, in the hope that it can be inspiring to those of you that are starting out on your journeys. So not too long ago, this was not something that was talked about in Virginia. There was not much conversation around wildlife crossings or corridors, but today, a lot of progress has been made. And it really all started, I think, when I really think about it, back to 6 years ago, when I was invited to a conference that the Wildlands Network hosted. And they were convening people to get together and think about what a connected landscape in the East could look like. And they're calling that the Eastern Wildway. And the Eastern Wildway is just one of several wildways contributing to this bold vision for restoring habitat connectivity. And wildways are really just cores of habitat connected by corridors or linkages between these cores. And when these are all connected up, they can facilitate safe passage for millions of creatures of all shapes and sizes. And there's wildways all across the US. There's one up and down from Mexico to Alaska. And if where you work falls into one of these wildways, it can be a really valuable tool to help conceptualize the importance of protecting landscapes. And even if you don't fall into a wildway, there's plenty of opportunity to improve habitat connectivity where you live. This is just one of the ways that we do it. And here in Virginia, our lands are contributing to that Eastern Wildway. So at this conference that Wildlands hosted, they told us about all the efforts that were happening around the East, in particular, some of the great work that was being done down in North Carolina, starting a coalition to get to work on connecting habitats. And they asked me if I wanted to try to start one up here. And so the next step was, well, yeah, we do, but how? Like, how do you start? And so we started by reaching out to Bridget Donaldson at the Virginia Transportation Research Council. And I just happened to know that she was interested because she'd conducted research on wildlife crossings in Virginia. And together we worked to establish the collaborative, and we pulled together all kinds of stakeholders and just started thinking about how can we enhance safe passage for wildlife in Virginia, and who's not here, like who's not at the table and should be. And that was why we ended every one of our meetings, and every meeting we had new people. And we did everything from mapping crash hotspots around the state to taking field tours together to look at like crossing locations. We explored citizen science opportunities, and most importantly, we supported each other. We supported each other's research, and we got the word out about the problem, and most importantly, that there were possible solutions. And so the folks that in that collaborative that were able to came together to work on policy, because we knew this was an important part of the puzzle. And so momentum started building, and we drew inspiration from other states like New Mexico and New Hampshire, who were passing wildlife crossing legislation. And our team sure relied on the inspiration and expertise of the Wildlands Network, and our partners at the Virginia Conservation Network provided indispensable advice and guidance on how to actually navigate the General Assembly. And then, of course, researchers like Bridget, they gave us the science we needed to take that to the legislator and say, hey, these wildlife crossings work. And we have a study from Virginia that shows that they do. So you can see on this slide, you can see all the wildlife that used a couple existing culverts once fencing was added to help funnel wildlife to those culverts rather than over the road. And at these particular sites, wildlife collisions were reduced by over 90%. So we had that study in hand when we were in the legislature talking to our decision makers. And this study was a very compelling story from our own state that we could bring around. And so some of the members of the collaborative we found pretty early on were members of agencies who could not do direct policy advocacy, but that was fine. They could still provide advice when we asked. And because we were already working together as members of this collaborative, seeking that advice was a lot easier. We had a dialogue and we knew each other to begin with. So in the first year, our coalition tried to pass legislation and it did not succeed. But in 2020, our hard work did pay off, and we passed a bill directing our state agencies to draft a wildlife corridor action plan. And what that does is identify barriers to wildlife movement and prioritize wildlife crossing projects. And the next year we passed another bill which required agencies to incorporate wildlife corridor action plan recommendations into their own plans. And so all these efforts led to the completion of our first wildlife corridor action plan in Virginia. Our Department of Transportation actually won a wildlife crossings pilot program grant last year so that we could incorporate more considerations and more species into that plan. And then the creation of this very cool Virginia Habitat Connectivity Hub that's hosted by our partners Wild Virginia. And it's really a one-stop shop to learn about how to get engaged in this work and to learn about all the efforts that are underway. So the collaborative is still stronger today than ever, and new ideas are popping up across the state, and new crossing projects are always being talked about. But our work's clearly not done yet. This year, we introduced a new bill, SB 555, which would establish a wildlife corridor grant fund. And this is important because it would provide a secure funding source for crossings and help to attract both federal dollars and private dollars for crossing efforts in Virginia. And although it passed the Senate, it was tabled in the House this year due to budget constraints. But we're not giving up, and we're already planning for 2025. And this slide's just showing, the incredible coalition of folks who signed on in support of this effort this year. And that's why we're optimistic about what's to come next. The momentum's here, and it's clearly not going away. So a couple quick things I just wanted to share from what we learned. The collaborative framework was really important. Working together was key. There were a lot of people who were interested in this work but didn't know where to start, and the collaborative gave us a place to come together and share ideas and resources, most importantly. And the organizations in the collaborative who worked on advocacy, like Wild Virginia and others, they were able to send out action alerts at key moments and ensure that legislators knew this issue was really important, not just to our group, but to all their constituents. And then the landscape level vision that Wildlands brought was exactly what we needed. That vision of what Virginia could look like and what we could contribute to on the entire East Coast was so motivating for us. And then, of course, Wildlands Network and the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators brought lessons and ideas from other states. They shared what was happening elsewhere so that we could do it here. And that's just something I think is so important, and why we wanted to share the resources like the State of the States report with you today. So I really enjoyed working along Wildlands in this work, and that's why I formally joined them this year. So I look forward to supporting other states in the same way I was provided support. And, because we're working towards large landscape level connected wildways. And to do that, we really do have to work together. So I hope these presentations helped inspire you. And I'm so sorry we don't have that much time for questions, but I do want to give Jonathan a chance to maybe ask a few from the Q&A in the chat, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Absolutely. Yeah, we got quite a few questions, so I'll just start right off the bat. Mike Vandeman asks, what is being done to protect plant, fungal, microbe connectivity? How does this affect that?
Anybody want to take that one? That's a good one. Yeah, go ahead.
There are states looking at it, but it certainly has not fallen to the top priority list because of the public safety piece and needing to find the co-benefit. I will say that for the crossings that are being built, that there are a lot of efforts to make sure that they're using native seed across them to encourage the movement of those species across the highway at the same time. So nothing designed specifically for it yet, as far as I have heard, maybe others here, but they are trying to combine those efforts when they can.
Another fantastic question. Aren't underpasses better for wildlife than overpasses, which is cheaper?
It's a great one. I will talk real quick about which one's cheaper. Typically underpasses are cheaper, and in Virginia's case, they were actually there already. So that was real handy. We just had to put some fencing around them. But it really depends on what species you're trying to mitigate for. And so different crossings are appropriate for different animals in different settings. And so, yeah, luckily in the East, we need a lot of tiny interventions, which are cheaper. But sometimes if you're dealing with a big migratory species like out West, you're just going to have to go over that road, and depending on the landscape as well.
Regarding the monitoring of wildlife travel, wildlife migration, do you work with specific universities or specific organizations to track this data?
There are a few universities that do engage in this work. Western Transportation Institute is tied to University in Montana. UC Davis in California is also involved. Virginia Tech also launched a program there as well. So there are a lot of universities involved in this, and the world of road ecology is really growing. They're collaring animals. They're also doing camera trapping. I think there was another question regarding the monitoring of progress, and those collars and that camera trapping is really one of the ways that we can tell whether or not wildlife are using the crossings that are up.
Is it important to fence highways to direct animals to use the crossing, and perhaps is it better to let them cross the road at night?
Yes, it's incredibly important to put funnel fencing up there. It can reduce vehicle collisions by over 90%. Some animals will just pass at nighttime anyway because they're more comfortable. So it really depends on the species.
During David's presentation, I believe he said that deer need a 60-second break in traffic to cross. Is there a reference for that or data for that? Where did that come from? What was the question?
Yeah, if you give me a second, I can drop that stat in the chat that yes, there is science behind that.
Which universities, you may have already mentioned this in the previous question, but which universities do the wildlife crossing research specifically?
UC Davis, Virginia Tech, and Western Transportation Institute is the Montana entity that's working on it that I most often hear about.
Perfect. Are there specific project areas that need assessments on the wildlife death specifically, specific areas of need, project areas?
I'm just going to ask the question, is that more like specifically in different states? Because there's so many scales, I guess, is what that question lends me to think about. You know, there's, like we showed, there's the wild way vision, right? Like that's one scale and think about this stuff. But if you're a city planner and you're dealing with, you know, down the road and trying to figure out, you know, where your crossings need to go and where that connected habitat is on either side of the roadway, I think it really matters what you're trying to mitigate for, what species you're working with, where you are, and what scale you're operating at. And so there's lots and lots of needs. There's so many, but it really is really specific to your site. And I think that's why we wanted to dig into case studies a little bit, because it helps you kind of see how other states kind of work through this stuff and figured out what they needed. And like you said, we could all talk about this all day.
Yeah, I think I would just quickly add too, I think from a perspective of getting engaged in advocacy, it also depends on the level in which you want to advocate and feel comfortable advocating. So like if you're already involved in other community activities in your state or your county, then that's a really good level to get involved in as well. And I think Aaron mentioned before, maybe it was Misty, about citizen science and tracking and keeping count of things. So I think there are a lot of entry points in the level question as well.
What about reducing the speed or installing traffic lights in the meantime while we wait for crossings to be installed? Could that be a viable solution?
Reducing speed limits. There have been studies on that. I believe Western Transportation Institute completed one, and unfortunately, a stop sign or a speed limit sign has not been shown to have enough of a positive impact to be a solution on its own. People take their speed limits into their own hands, as we all know, regardless of signage. I do think that the wildlife detection signs have shown some promise, particularly because people become numb to the deer crossing signs. So if you have something that's specifically triggered by animal movement and people know what those signs are, they're a little bit more apt to be looking for those wildlife and slowing down, particularly in areas where there are large animals that they could get in a lot of trouble and get hurt if they hit.
And I believe the last question from Amanda, are there any suggestions for advocating when there are not big economic impacts associated with a species, like perhaps a smaller species that is less noticed in collision?
Yeah, that's something we dealt with in Virginia. Just briefly, I can mention, you know, there are a lot of very sensitive species that are tiny. You don't even notice sometimes when you run them over. And so some of the same methods we were looking at for large wildlife can work for smaller species. A lot of little directional fencing to tiny little crossings, like for salamanders. We've actually got one north of town here. Just a lot more little things like that in places where we know there's a concern can be great. And the cool thing is it doesn't cost as much money because they're smaller. So, and people tend to really notice some of these spots, like salamander brigades, those folks that carry salamanders across the road in buckets. I mean, if you start talking to folks and asking, people know where some of these places are, and that really helps identify where things need to happen. And then you just have to raise a smaller amount of funding to get something done.
That's it for the questions, I believe.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks everybody for staying over just a couple minutes. I really appreciate it. I just want to thank all of our panelists. I'm so glad you were all here. I'm so honored to get to present alongside all of you. Thank you, Jonathan, for taking questions. And thanks to all of you for showing up. Please remember, if you like what you learned today, please support all of our work. We want to keep doing this for you. And I hope to see you all on the next webinar. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. It was great.
Thank you, everyone.